Thank you so much to Petri and to Kristen for this wonderful introduction. I want to be a bit provocative. I want to make sure that when we talk about innovation and even missions, that we don't see it as a reason to be comfortable and cozy. It actually means to really redirect the system. And I even changed my slide about 5 minutes, 5 minutes before you arrived, to make it even bolder. It means redirecting not just innovation, not just growth, but the kind of capitalism that we have today. And you know what's interesting is Schumpeter, that this lecture is named after, most of what he actually said about innovation, he got from Marx. There was very little new in Schumpeter with innovation. He kind of forgot to, actually he did cite Marx, he didn't cite Keynes enough. But what's really new in Schumpeter, which isn't appreciated enough, he said that the theory of the economy that we have, the theory of competition, makes no sense, because actually firms under capitalism compete through innovation, and that causes constant turbulence. It causes creative destruction. It causes disequilibrium. It causes heterogeneity between firms and companies, which are long-run properties of the system. And yet, the body of economic thought that guides so much policy worldwide is based on equilibria, representative agents, averages, medians. And he said, this is wrong. Why should we have to talk about imperfect competition to talk about innovation? Anyway, so this is what I really want to, in some ways, welcome, which is if we take innovation seriously, if we look at issues like what innovative small enterprises need in order to innovate and to scale up, we actually also need a different theory of how the economy works. And in particular, I will focus on the need for a different theory of what policy is, and hence what the public sector is. And this is very important, of course, given the European Commission's role today in trying to help steer Europe to be not only competitive, but also to really tackle some of the most important goals we have ahead. And as was mentioned by Kristen, I've worked very closely with also Carlos Modas recently, the Commissioner for Research and Innovation. And what's interesting is that this concept of missions, which I kind of want to break down for you and explain why it's such a radical, uncomfortable word that shouldn't make us all feel cozy, but really think about what we need to change, really occurred after decades that Europe was already talking about challenges. It's not that new, right? Plastered all over the Commission with smart, inclusive, sustainable growth. Also, of course, at the United Nations and in many countries. So what I want to talk later, towards the end of the lecture, is what does it mean to really tackle these challenges in a concrete way that can guide growth and can guide public sector and private sector activity in fundamentally new ways. But also, even these words, they're quite radical. I just came today with an airplane from the United Kingdom, which is about to go through an election, and everyone's talking about their election manifestos, but there's not one paper that I've seen that has put these issues at the center. And in the UK, the current model of growth, literally, not even model, the current paradigm, how growth is occurring, is not this way. Even just the first word, smart growth, which assumes investment-led growth, is not happening. The UK is growing through consumption-led growth, which is fueled by private debt. So the ratio of private debt to disposable income is back at the level it was just before the crisis. And that's what caused the crisis. So you would think this would be like at the core of the national debate, and the election manifestos would be talking about it, but they're not. And this is also true across Europe, that we don't really necessarily take these words to mean, oh my God, we really have to change. We also have to change our corporate governance structures. In many parts of the world, corporations in recent years have increasingly spent their profits that they earn not to reinvest in productive capacity, research and development, human capital and training, but in many cases, not all, just to kind of boost the share price, so buying back shares to boost share prices and stock options. For the Fortune 500 companies, $3 trillion 3 trillion, that's 12 zeros, have been spent in the last 10 years just in buying back shares. And when these large companies are buying up small companies and SMEs, it's not so much the buying up that's the problem, is what then is the system, the ecosystem, what happens to the research and the thinking, the out-of-the-box thinking of those small companies when they're bought up by an ultra-financialized large company, which is different from a non-financialized company. So these questions of governance, both in the public sector, how do we govern the public sector, how do we govern the private sector, and how can they relate to one another in more interesting ways in order to fuel smart innovation-led growth, growth that's more sustainable, and growth that reduces inequality instead of increasing it, really should be at the heart of what we're talking about when we talk about innovation and when we talk about economic growth. But unfortunately, this often doesn't happen. And this is also because we're not necessarily prepared to talk about it. In other words, the tools that we have at hand are just so boring. I mean, I often go through these words and I kind of do a theatrical action because it really is boring. Just look at the words. The policy institutions are supposed to de-risk the risk takers. They're supposed to enable them, facilitate them, administer, regulate, redistribute. So if we really want to take seriously those challenges that I had up there before, what we need, even within public institutions, is the same kind of things we often are told that we need in private institutions, especially if you've ever come close to someone who's taken, or if you have taken, a master's in business administration course. The words are so much more exciting. Literally, the courses that you take if you're a top manager in an MBA class, they're really exciting. It's all about organizational behavior, decision sciences, strategic management. Also take risks and maybe screw up every now and then, but get up again and later you will succeed. People actually brag inside the private sector of the risks they took. And yet if you take risks inside the public sector, if you make one mistake, you're on the front page of the newspapers. So really the question is, what do we want from the governance mechanisms within organizations, public, private, and increasingly third sector institutions? And what do we mean by redesigning literally the relationships between them in order to tackle those challenges? And again, the reason why these words are so kind of boring is because we have continued to think that in order to steer growth and in the European region in ways that actually achieve, better things can be done simply by putting different types of patches. And in economics, we call this fixing market failures. And even SME finance is seen as fixing the problem of asymmetric information. That small companies, you don't know how good they are, they don't have as much equity and assets, and so banks will not lend to them. And so this idea that maybe the public sector has to come in and do some SME financing. Or when you have positive externalities and you have areas that have very high spillover effects like basic research does and knowledge, then you have too little investment in it by the private sector. So again, government comes in and fixes that problem, invests in basic R&D. Or negative externalities, the opposite, things that companies are doing too much that are creating problems in the economy, then we need some sort of tax, for example, a carbon tax. And all these different market failures do exist. It would be crazy to pretend they don't. But the real question is, can we simply fix our way, putting bandages and patching things up in order to really drive Europe towards these amazing challenges of smart growth, innovation-led growth, sustainable growth, and inclusive growth? And my answer is absolutely not. What we really need to do is kind of debunk this notion that entrepreneurship is only in some parts of the economy, for example, just in business. We really need to debunk this cartoon image, which, if you're a young person coming out of school, where would you want to work? With the Kafkian bureaucrat, which is always painted with these boring words, or I shouldn't put Zuckerberg up there now because he's no longer seen as cool given the recent Cambridge Analytica stuff, but still, this more colorful, funky, venture capital, garage tinkers, gazelles, right? We really require entrepreneurialism, entrepreneurship, and also just literally rethinking markets, allowing really markets to be what they are, which is outcomes of how public and private and third sector meet, which includes, by the way, trade unions. I often have to remind people, just remember, some of the greatest advances we've had in capitalism occurred because the labor movement fought for it, and that helped to design markets in better ways. We would not have weekends. We would not have the 8-hour workday without what trade unions fought for. And one of the issues today, these conversations about universal basic income, in some ways we should really be asking, what is the equivalent of the weekend today that really would benefit everyone, even those who are not unionized, but that we really need kind of the labor movement itself to be fighting for. Anyway, what's interesting is that if you accept this dichotomy, which is simply a cartoon image of the state on the left, de-risking and redistributing, enabling, these are all words we all use, and the other side, all the creativity and entrepreneurship, then it would be literally impossible to understand the history of the most radical innovations, the kind of innovations that Schumpeter actually meant when he talked about creative destruction, really upsetting current status quo in different sectors and new sectors arising. Because what all these different really radical general purpose technologies have in common is that you really had much more ambitious, risk-taking, investor of first resort role of public institutions, which then were able to crowd in private sector investment, and in the case of small, medium enterprise, really support also those that were willing to innovate and invest, and I'll come back to that later. But my basic point here is that if we don't understand what the public sector did to get us the GPTs, then we're not going to be able to get the SDGs. I only say it that way because it rhymes, GPT, SDG. But it's true. This is so much harder. The Sustainable Development Goals, these 17 goals that have 169 targets beneath them, are really difficult. They are the so-called wicked problems, right? They involve social, technological, and behavioral changes. It's not just like getting to the moon, which was mainly technological, as hard as that was. So really unpicking what is the role of the private sector, how can we use ambitious policies to really crowd in, to catalyze new forms of partnerships, and to create additionality. In other words, make things happen that would not have happened anyway. How can we do that? It really does require going beyond these dichotomies of thinking that we simply need an enabling environment or set the rules of the game, get rid of these different types of imperfections and then get out of the way. That narrative has to change, but the question is, what is the new narrative, right? If we're left with no narrative, then we're just kind of messy and start doing things a bit too idiosyncratically. So what I tried to do in my 2 recent books, apologies if this is very self-promotional, but hey, you invited me to give a talk, so. So in the entrepreneurial state, what I did was to really debunk and to unpick, really, what actually happened in that place in the world that we still talk about as being one of the most innovative places, which was Silicon Valley. And this myth that it was mainly about venture capital, mainly about entrepreneurs and the garage tinkerers, in the state at best did some basic science, which was later commercialized. I kind of, tried to really kind of unpick that and then ask what are the lessons for other countries, but also for the future in terms of driving the next big revolution, which I think we all hope will be a green revolution. And I don't say let's copy and paste Silicon Valley, because that would be foolish, but I do say let's at least not learn the wrong lessons. So in the UK, again, we have Silicon Roundabout in the east of London, which has learned all the wrong lessons. This idea that, okay, you can just put a bunch of startups together and mix them up and bring in some venture capital, surprise, surprise, not much happens. And in The Value of Everything, the more recent book, what I do is unpick that even further and say, what does this mean for how we think about value? And why is it so easy for some actors, including Lloyd Blankfein, after the financial crisis, he was the CEO of Goldman Sachs, to say, that Goldman Sachs workers are value creators. They are the most productive in the world, he said. Why is it so easy for that statement to be said without anyone kind of really calling into question this concept of value? And so in that book, what I do is go back to the history, 400 years, don't worry, I won't do it tonight, 400 years of value theory, and show that really what's happened is that really intense debate about what is value. Is it labor? Is it farm labor for the physiocrats? What is the production boundary? What is productive and unproductive has gone missing. So the word value isn't even used in economics department. It's just kind of micro 101. And the word value has gone to business schools. So shareholder value, shared value, value chains, but there isn't really a contestation, a debate about what do we understand as wealth creation, value creation, who are the wealth creators? And that's a very important question, especially, to be honest, in conferences like this, where the word keeps popping up. I even heard it just in the last hour, speaking to people. The SMEs are where all the wealth creation occurs. Really? Maybe. What we really need are entrepreneurial systems and allowing those few SMEs who even want to innovate, about 6% of them, to really be supported. And what do we know about the social system that we require around them to really allow them, again, to have the patience, for example, because impatient capital is an enemy of innovation and entrepreneurship. Where does the patience come from? Where does the whole social structure that they need around them in order to scale up? We should talk about that wealth generating system around them and obsess a bit less about the garage tinkerers themselves. And I once had a very funny thing happen to me. This guy, Bill Gates, was writing me emails, which I thought was like a hacker, right? Someone trying to, I don't know, get into my Outlook. So I didn't respond. And finally his PA reached out to mine saying, it's kind of rude. He's not used to this. Could you please tell her to respond? I think Andre had some problems with me answering emails too. Anyway, so I finally responded and I went, he flew me out, I can't remember if it was business class or not, but hopefully it was, to Seattle, and I had a whole day with him. And he really is very, not just smart, but useful in many ways to our joint cause, because he doesn't do the Peter Thiel thing, which is, state sucks. Let's have a secessionist movement in California and allow the entrepreneurs to secede so they don't have to pay tax. I don't know if you know what I'm talking about, but that's the Peter Thiel kind of propaganda. Bill Gates doesn't say that. He says, Steve Jobs and I benefited massively from public investments. And without that, we wouldn't have been able to do what we did. And it's great that he says it. And I said to him, you should, create a forum, because every time countries have problems with growth, they just say, let's just lower tax, or we just need sort of more finance to come in to help our SMEs, or we need to reduce the public debt. They don't hear this ambition that when you're not growing, you need to rethink your public structures and really create those investments, which later can really help the businesses that want to innovate. And yet, even Bill is a bit limited. Notice that what he's saying here is he's basically just focusing on the role of basic research, which we all know, right? That's that public good problem. So if it was just, come in, governments, fund basic science, and we'll do the rest, it would, first of all, be much easier, because that's all policy would have to do. But also the question is that really what happened with those general purpose technologies I put up before? And so what I tried to do in the entrepreneurial state, but I find myself having to repeat it many different times because I don't think the lesson has been learned, is that actually what really was required to generate one of the most entrepreneurial parts of the world, again, the Silicon Valley model, was a level of public intervention that goes way beyond what any of these market failure fixing ideas would generate. It was much more than just basic research. It was basic research, it was applied research, it was patient long-term finance. Downstream, even Death Valley can take 15 years. It's not just a 2 or 3 year period. So patient long-term finance in that Death Valley phase. It required ambitious procurement policy, so government as purchaser. Without that, we basically wouldn't have had Moore's Law. All those chips that were bought by the US government allowed really the costs to fall much more rapidly. And even more downstream, we've had very bold demand-side policies. The reason that Tesla sells something like well, I can't remember, but something like 30% of its cars in Norway is due to the demand side policies of the Norwegian government. And on the supply side, Tesla, the car itself, received a $500 million guaranteed loan from the US government. So the supply side, the demand side, and what's interesting is all these policies that I just mentioned have organizations behind them. It's not just public money thrown from a helicopter. There's particular organizations, and I've just put some of those here, but I should have also put Sitra, which is so important, and we're in Finland. I'm actually on the board of Sitra, and I accepted to be on the board of Sitra some years ago because I was very interested in one of its phases where it was also providing a lot of patient finance, actually to companies like Nokia itself, in order to innovate. So Yozma is a public venture capital fund in Israel. Without Yozma, there would have been no startup nation in Israel. So that long-term patient committed finance. Of course, you know about DARPA, which invested in the early internet, but also CERN itself. Without CERN, we wouldn't have HTML. Without public banks like the KfW or the European Investment Bank today, we wouldn't have, again, enough patient finance in Europe. But what's interesting, and I'll come back to this later, each one of these organizations was mission-oriented. If you look at their websites, I have some of the statements later, they don't describe themselves as, I'm here to fix markets or to enable the private sector. They were very, very ambitious. And even if this was the kind of theatrical bit of the entrepreneurial state, everything that makes our smart products today smart and not stupid, you don't pick up your phone and say, I'm speaking on my stupid phone. It's a smartphone. It's smart because of the technology. It's smart because of what you can do with it. So the internet, GPS, Siri, or the touchscreen display, they were all invested in through public financial institutions, regardless of whether it was through procurement or actual public servants. And those organizations, whether it was the CIA, which funded the touchscreen display, so be careful when you put your finger on your phone the next time. Again, DARPA, which also invested in Siri. If you kind of break down all these different organizations, we should be asking those MBA kinds of questions, right? What actually occurred in that organization? What allowed that public institution to take risks? How did it interact with the SME population? In the US, for example, the Small Business Innovation Research Program, SBIR, has been a key financier of lots of small businesses, but not just because they're cute and small, this kind of blanket SME policy which leads to nothing, but really using procurement, 3% of each department, so Department of Health, Department of Energy, Department of Defense budget, to fuel SME activity that was procuring something that the government needed, whether it was for education, health, defense, or energy. And SBIR, this program, which again is focused on SMEs, what's interesting is it's almost always preceded venture capital financing. So the venture capitalists look, who's receiving SBIR funding? And then they go and provide the next stage financing because they think the filtering process of SBIR is a very smart one. But the truth is that it's actually SBIR that provides that early stage, high-risk finance, the really seed phase, them as well as business angels, but that's just friends and family, and most of us don't have rich friends and family, and then the VCs come later. And the problem with venture capital, by the way, is that how it's developed over time is also quite dangerous for many small companies that are trying to innovate. Venture capital is very exit-driven, and they want to exit in 3 or 5 years. And that's led to some dysfunctions in many sectors that we should be wary of today as we see new sectors emerge. So in the biotech sector, for example, it's created many PLIPOs, sounds like a disease, productless IPOs, because this rush to exit in 3 or 5 years doesn't really help, especially in science-intensive sectors like biotech, nanotech, or today clean technology. And recently I've been doing quite a bit of work on the clean tech kind of area. It's a very nice area to do quantitative work because there's a very good database funded by Bloomberg, the Bloomberg New Energy Finance Database, where you literally can trace every penny of of any money, private and public money in clean tech. And you can see kind of who's financing what and why it matters. So if you have too much short-term capital going into specific parts of the clean tech sector, we need to be wary of whether that sector is given the kind of patience to innovate. But what's interesting is literally if you just make it into a four-square quadrant here and put higher capital intensity on the vertical axis and risk on the horizontal, that upper right-hand quadrant, you see lots of different types of public actors, which again, we kind of ignore. We don't really understand how they're working. And if you look at the different types of actors in renewables, there's many different kinds. There's public banks, private equity, venture capital, different types of government agencies. And what should be happening, really, if the government's playing its role, as it did for Bill Gates and for Steve Jobs, is to really be financing the frontier. The frontier, those areas that are still both highly capital intensive, but also very uncertain and high risk. So they can kind of lay out the platform for later companies to enter who tend to be more risk averse. And you see this, in fact, if you break it down into different parts of the renewable energy sector. You see that in wind, the public sector led, and then once the private sector came in, it was fine for the public sector to invest less, whereas in marine, which is still very risky today because it's just less also diffused, you still have the public sector having to take on that leadership. But if you again break down all the different sources of finance, in clean tech, one thing that's interesting is the strong presence of these development finance institutions, which basically means public banks. So in Europe, it includes public banks like the KfW, but also the European Investment Bank. And if you look at what they're doing, this is data, a 10-year period between 2001 2012, what you see is a classic role, what Keynes would have argued for, which is that the public sector should be counter-cyclical, right? When you have a crisis or when you have a boom, the private sector invests too much, so the public sector doesn't necessarily have to play a leading role. And when you have a bust, you have a retreat of private finance, so you need that counter-cyclicality, which we kind of forgot to do in Europe if you look at us aggregately after the crisis. There was a lot of pro-cyclical kind of austerity type policies, but we don't have to talk about that. What's interesting here is that the KfW played a very classical counter-cyclical role from the crisis, right? They increased their investments massively, but they also did something bigger, which was to direct that investment towards the climate protection projects in Germany. And one of the things that's interesting is that this wasn't just for the SMEs. This really was meant to transform the economy in a green direction. So when the steel sector needed money, as it always seems to need money, it's now going bust in Italy with Ilva, it recently in May went bust in the UK, and they come asking government for a bailout. What happened in Germany, and this is what I mean by redesign, what happened in Germany is that when the steel sector needed money, the conditions attached to the loans that the steel sector received were that the steel sector had to lower its material content. So innovate, transform. And this is really interesting for a public actor to be both pushing the frontier, to be counter-cyclical, but also to create conditions which mean that you're not just handing out money, it's not just a handout machine, but really creating the conditions for an economic transformation. And if you look at the website, again, whether it's about the KfW or NASA, which of course was very important with the moon landing, or the DARPAs of the world, or the National Institutes of Health, which in the US have really financed huge amounts of the health innovation that has also benefited actually worldwide medicine research, they again don't describe themselves as simply tinkering on the edges. But they really, if you break down these mission statements, they're very entrepreneurial. They talk about kind of creating new markets, about really taking on the uncertainty that's required to engineer kind of a revolution that's required in a country, for example, around a green transition, or creating breakthrough technologies for specific aims like national security. So this is where I want to kind of pause and say, it was this thinking and this kind of eureka moment, which is to say, oh my God, and yet no one's talking about this, that got me to work very closely with the European Commission, with Carlos Moedas in particular, to say, what would it look like if the way that policy is designed in Europe really takes this mission concept seriously? And what are the public sector capabilities that we need literally how we do the evaluation, how we design the grants, how we do procurement, how we help SMEs instead of just, again, blanket helicopter money, if we take this kind of notion of public purpose and missions seriously. And so in this report that I wrote, which then I was very happy became kind of a legal instrument, the missions were, decided upon in Europe through consultation and then voting, that it was an important instrument to help guide innovation policy. The idea is really simple. The idea is that you begin with the biggest challenges of our time, which really should be the SDGs. We don't have to rethink that, but it's important for each country or region to also contextualize it and the specific goals they might have. But then to get very serious about it by creating missions where you can actually say yes or no, did you achieve it? Right? Climate change, what does that mean? If you make it a specific mission around clean growth, a certain percentage of carbon emissions in a city or a region in a specific amount of time, yes, you can answer, yes or no. And to really take seriously the missions, to learn from the moonshot, but to apply it to the social problems of our time, the wicked problems, means to really understand that no one sector, no one company, no one entrepreneur is going to innovate alone to solve any of these problems. We need as many different sectors as possible. So to take both industrial strategy and innovation policy away from a sectoral approach, or the size of a firm approach, again, SME financing, towards a real cross-sectoral approach where you really focus on the mission and then ask yourself, how can we galvanize and catalyze as many different sectors to help solve that problem? And then again, reforming government instruments like procurement and grants to fuel the bottom-up experimentation. I'll repeat, bottom-up, bottom-up, bottom-up. And that's where the SME population becomes so important, to fuel different types of solutions, of which some will fail, some will succeed, towards solving those challenges. And so the one that I think is so interesting recently that's been talked about around the world is, of course, the plastic-free ocean. The reason I think it's interesting is that the reason it's become so popular to talk about it was actually, in some ways, due to the arts, the creative sector. So, David Attenborough's wonderful film called Blue Planet, the documentary, many different episodes. The last episode with the dolphins choking, or the fish choking on plastic, just really resonated, I think, with lots of young people. So I have 4 children, and all 4 of them know everything, it seems, about the plastic in the ocean because of how they were engaged through a very, very well-done documentary. And the question of how can we engage the arts, music, all sorts of different sectors to really frame these missions to be as inspirational as possible, as bold as possible, to catalyze cross-sectoral, cross-actor, cross-disciplinary interactions. And I should repeat, disciplinary, because I'm an academic, and all too often we think it's just the STEM subjects, right? The sciences are going to help us innovate, when actually, let's get some poets, let's get some philosophers to also help us really frame these missions to be as bold and exciting as possible. And so in the report, I tried to be as kind of guiding, but also open-ended, obviously, because this was just the beginning of how to think about missions. So I've already mentioned the importance to be bold and inspirational, but who decides? Who should decide what's bold and inspirational? Is it the benign dictator who tells us what to do? Or how do we really, even at that phase, bring lots of different voices to the table? And you might have heard that there's a whole movement, I talk again about the trade union movement, around the just transition, to make sure that when we transition towards a greener economy, we don't leave many different types of workers behind. The challenge on that is, how do you bring workers and different voices and students and the student movement and the green movement to the table ex ante, not just ex post, defending themselves against what might be an unjust transition, but even to define it. So being open to pluralistic different voices at the table. A clear direction, you can actually say yes or no, did you achieve it? To be really ambitious, but also realistic. This cannot take forever. So to work both with existing capacity, new capacity, upgrading that capacity, but really to use some of our biggest strengths to tackle the challenges we have. And I already mentioned cross-sectoral, cross-actor, I mean public, private, third sector, civil society organizations. In many different areas like health and energy, increasingly we have organizations that are not in the neither kind of strictly private nor strictly public sector investing huge amounts. And this issue of really driving through those bottom-up solutions. And in the second report I wrote, what I did was divide it into 3 areas, which was to say, you know what, none of this is going to happen unless governments, the member states, don't change what they're doing. Don't change how, again, they are interacting with different types of businesses. And broke it down into 3. One was financing, one was public sector capabilities, and the third was citizen engagement. In the financing, let me just say, it's really important because the total amount of money that the European Commission has for the missions is not that much. The whole Horizon program is about 100 billion. And even if missions got a third or a bit more of a third, that would be at best what the US government currently spends, and it's correct to make the comparison because the US GDP is similar to the whole European GDP, what the US spends just around health innovation, right? So this means that how you design the financial tools, for example, in the EIF, in the EIB, in our public banks becomes absolutely critical because designing it to catalyze, to inspire lots of other types of investments, right? So this is also that key word, mission-oriented, which is really kind of focused on the big, bold, inspirational goals, but again, all the details then matter in terms of how you catalyze other types of investment. And the public sector capabilities literally means what does it mean for how we rethink procurement instead of it just being, in Italian we say appalto, which literally just means a contract, which already just makes you think of the government giving something to the private sector. No, really procure. What are the, what's the purpose? What are we trying to do? And then welcome lots of different types of private sector actions in that space. To get to the moon, Honeywell, General Electric, Motorola innovated a lot, but they weren't innovating because the public sector was asked to simply commercialize or to be business friendly or to show their economic value on Earth. It was, hey, we got a problem, help us, right? Help us solve that problem. And of course they made profits. It was not an anti-profit policy, but it was bringing in the private sector to fuel innovation and investment for solving particular goals. How do you retain that kind of entrepreneurial public sector activity in terms of being flexible and adaptable and knowing when to turn the tap off? So all these different issues here are very important, including the portfolio management. I've talked about this quite a bit with governments. I find it striking that when we have portfolios, if we do, often government is just seen as spending. And I say, no, you have to be an investor first resort. Think of a whole portfolio. When things go bad, they then, are asked to pick up the bill. When things go well, it's seen as a private sector success. So in the US, the same amount of money was given to Tesla and Solyndra, 500 million in a guaranteed loan. Solyndra went bust. It was a solar company. Taxpayer bailed them out. Tesla did quite well. Oh, Elon Musk, he's a genius. Right? And what Obama actually said to Elon, he said, if you don't pay back the loan, we get 3 million shares in your company. And why would you want 3 million shares in a crappy company that doesn't pay back its loan? Had they said, we get 3 million shares if you do well, the price per share went from 9 to 90. And multiply that by 3 million, that would have more than paid the Solyndra loss and the next round. So that kind of entrepreneurial spirit and portfolio thinking is required if we want government to take the kind of risks that it took to get us Silicon Valley. We could just forget about it and say you can just fund it through tax, you can create money, but we know that doesn't work for all sorts of political reasons. And also I don't think the tax system itself was necessarily devised in order for funding these kinds of really high-risk investments. So as you know, Europe has actually now come up with these different mission areas. I'm not going to comment on them because I had nothing to do with them, but the point is there was lots of sort of stakeholder engagement, and these are areas within which different missions will be selected, and they also have mission boards that are really thinking critically now about how to do that. What I want to focus on in my last minutes is what it actually means, again, on the ground. On the ground, it means, again, really changing the narrative away from one of just fixing towards co-creating, co-shaping, sharing risks, sharing rewards. It requires to stop pretending that policy is about leveling the playing field. It has to be about tilting it towards a direction, but the direction is not one company or one sector, but it's really making that big bet like around a Green New Deal and then forming the different policies that we need to really tilt things that we are rewarding those companies and those activities that are willing to take those risks to go in that direction. And what we've done through the institute that I run around the world now is we're also helping governments transform the notion of industrial strategy, right? In Europe, we were mainly talking about innovation policy, but industrial strategy too often is just a list of sectors. In the UK, for example, it was aerospace, automobile, life sciences, creative industries, and financial services. You know, to do what? To do what? So it was very easy for those sectors to come asking for money. Instead, changing it around and saying the industrial strategy will focus on these 4 big challenges, which we help the government kind of think about, and then those challenges having specific missions. You know, this already kind of means that through an industrial strategy, you can both solve societal goals, but then really fuel activity, innovation, and support across the whole economy, not just your list of top sectors, as I call them in Holland, or key sectors in other places. This was one example of, in the UK government, thinking about the future of mobility. When they came out with their mission, all we did was help them make that thing in the orange there a bit more interesting, which was even just introduce the word 100% accessible, which would mean a lot of different types of innovation and new thinking around disabilities. Then when we have public banks, I've already mentioned their importance. With Nicola Sturgeon, the First Minister of Scotland, we helped her set up a public bank, but then said, be careful, don't make this again a handout machine. What does it mean to have a public finance, a public fund, which is steering and helping those organizations, even in civil society organizations, private institutions, that are, again, willing to invest in the most difficult challenges that Scotland is facing. By the way, this notion of public finance is quite interesting. I think in Finland you also have VAKE and PESI, and they're extremely important. It's extremely important to have public funds that are willing to go in the long term. And it doesn't necessarily have to be the YASMA kind of public venture capital fund or the KfW public bank, but you definitely need a form of patient finance. And it's interesting that there's different forms it may take, but it's very hard to find any country that has really innovated without some form of patient finance, which then can again crowd in other forms of finance. We also have been thinking about what does this mean for production, literally for the way that, for example, in the health sector, pharmaceutical companies interact with that social structure that I was talking about before. This is a striking sector where so much money goes in from public institutions, and yet the prices of the products are simply set by the pharmaceutical industry, and then the welfare state has to come in and kind of subsidize it, but the taxpayer pays 2 or 3 different times. What does it mean to really have a mission-oriented approach? Because the military, when it finances health, when it finances drugs, because soldiers need medicines on the war territory, they are not naive. They get it at the price that makes sense given what they financed. And yet we have sort of accepted that we are simply fueling, if you want, profits in the health sector, and as long as some medicines come out, we're happy, without really rethinking how to design the system to be more symbiotic and mutualistic so the prices themselves reflect that public contribution. And working with different cities, I don't really have time to talk about it. This is, I think, very interesting that, again, in terms of the implications for the public sector capabilities, all this talk about innovation and technology and general purpose technologies and circular economy and SME financing tends to be on the periphery. Then you go to the economics and finance ministry, or in Europe, DG ECFIN, and it's all about sort of hardcore growth. And it's very important to start unpicking that, which is, for example, again, at the national level, how does the Treasury even evaluate a public investment? Is it just about cost benefit or net present value, or how do you really not only nurture but evaluate all the spillovers that happen along the way? So again, those iPhone examples I gave in the beginning, the internet and GPS were spillovers of trying to solve a problem, right? The problem was to get the satellites to communicate, internet was an answer. GPS trying to get the missiles to be much more guided. What does it mean to both take the problem-solving exercise seriously and how we evaluate growth, but especially the spillovers along the way, those cross-sectoral spillovers that even the Concorde plane had. Concorde's not flying, but huge amounts of spillovers across many different sectors. It's never been properly evaluated. And if we don't think through these kinds of issues, it's not going to be easy to really redirect capitalism in those ways that I was talking about, because all those interesting innovation things will remain on the periphery. So bringing innovation to the heart about how we think about growth means that the treasuries and ministries of finance need new tools. And this I've already mentioned through the example of the prices in the pharmaceutical industry, or the issue about equity in the kind of Tesla cylinder case. But this really, I think, is a very important question. And the state of California today is thinking about it in terms of a wealth fund, in the same way that in many Scandinavian countries, like in Norway, there's a sovereign wealth fund. What does it mean not to think about just UBI, which is like a handout to the citizen, but a citizen's share, a citizen's dividend, so that we actually have innovation-led growth and inclusive growth together. We redesign them together so that the ways that citizens benefit from it is not ex post, but even how we design these instruments ex ante. And it's just much more interesting as a narrative. It's, wealth creation as also a progressive agenda instead of just wealth redistribution. As important as redistribution is, it's not a winning narrative. It's also not what wins the election, unfortunately. So really rethinking both the redistribution, as important as it is, but giving citizens the power, both through the mission-oriented programs, putting them at the table in terms of the stakeholder engagement, but also the rewards for this collective action and collective value creation. And I'm done. This is just a slide of the institute that I run, which really tries to put public value and public purpose at the core of political economy. And if any of you are interested in engaging with us on it, please do get in touch. But I think that this is central to really rethink the system, how we drive innovation away from these dichotomies and cartoon images of the entrepreneur, which tomorrow I'm sure you'll be talking about a lot in really smart ways, but to really keep asking, what is an entrepreneurial system? How do we co-create that system together, and how do we share in the benefits together for real, as opposed to just some kind handouts? I'm done. Thank you. Is there time for questions? Yeah? Okay.
Thank you very much, Mariana. I think this was absolutely fantastic. I think one of the most insightful and energetic Schumpeter lectures that we've ever heard during the SME Assemblies. And I simply repeat my plea to my colleagues: we should seriously consider renaming this event to Mazzucato
Thank you.
Innovation Lecture for good grounds. I know time is running, but I think this is a great opportunity to pose one or two sharp questions to Mariana, and then my dear colleague and boss, Jari Gustafsson, actually will give some broader insights from the Finnish perspective. But colleagues, raise your hand and make the question, please. Anyone? Oh, yes.
Thank you. A couple of questions. I have to look at my notes here. How do you change? You mentioned early on in your presentation about the consumer-led economy in the UK. How do you drive a change from consumer-led in an economy like the UK to an investment-led economy? And also you mentioned about the public banks, and they shouldn't be just a handout medium. How do you then choose where the investment should be? Who decides that? How do you do that?
Great. Okay, this will take me another 40 minutes. No, just kidding. So first of all, what I was saying about the UK is not just that it's consumption-led, but that consumption is fueled by private debt, and that's because real wages have not been growing since basically the 1980s. And so even just to stay in place, debt had to be taken out. So that kind of narrative after the crisis was all these irresponsible people, spent too much on their credit cards. Well, actually, no, the problem was the real incomes weren't growing. So the first thing I don't think I need this because there's all these other things. The first thing is we need real incomes to go up so we don't have the private debt-fueled consumption, which is the big problem. And that requires all sorts of policies as well as increasing the bargaining power in different ways. It doesn't have to happen through unions. By the way, I was just in Mondragon, Spain. There they have a whole history of cooperatives, for example, or John Lewis in the UK, right? So there's different models of corporate governance. Scandinavia should be bragging about this. You have a stakeholder, not a shareholder governance structure of companies. You don't hear about that often. We should have a European region that also really learns what works, what doesn't, and especially under the Finnish presidency of the Commission, I had sort of asked them to really bring that to the fore. So to change that to investment-led, what you also need is a different type of policy. So many policies in the UK, like in some other countries, have been based on the assumption that business already wants to invest, and you just have to make things easier, so different types of tax incentives or tax cuts. The truth is they didn't actually want to invest. They were properly happy either just with inertia or making money in other ways, and so that really required that bold, mission-oriented, again, investments in the public institutions, and that's where this industrial strategy in the UK came from, this idea that, okay, to move to a more investment-led growth strategy, we need government to change, focus less on indirect and more indirect. And your second question is, how do you make those decisions, whether it's through a public bank or not? And this, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy because we narrated, we told the story of government as just fixing markets. The kind of people, I hate to put it this way, but in some countries, the kind of people that were also then stimulated to go work in government weren't necessarily also some of the kind of, people who had that investment savvy knowledge or even scientific knowledge. Because if you were a top scientist, why would you want to go run a ministry? In the US, when they had their $800 billion stimulus program after the crisis, they were able to get Steve Chu, a Nobel Prize winning physicist, to run the Department of Energy. He set up ARPA-E, right, to, again, reorient the U.S. economy in a green direction, and they got the top talent, enter the civil service, which doesn't mean in other countries you don't have top talent, but the point is there is a self-fulfilling prophecy that the more we can say government is about transforming as much as the private sector is, and they need to collaborate, co-invest, share risks, welcome risk-taking in public institutions, the kind of people you will attract to work in your public bank is very different than let's just go de-risk Elon Musk. I could say more, but then,
Perfect.
Yeah.
There's another question there, at least in the back, please.
But sorry, it's also missions. So the missions are not picking one technology. If you put all your eggs in one basket, like just offshore wind, you'll fail, right? So this notion of a portfolio, so you pick a direction, and then the bank stimulates lots of different cross-sectoral, cross-actor projects, bottom up, but that's the direction. That's kind of gets you thinking about what does it mean to have a portfolio. But it's not picking winners. It's picking the willing for a certain mission.
Hello, my name is Mark Sanders, I'm from Utrecht. My question is, you mentioned in your talk that you propose to tilt the playing field. And we've been doing lots of research on entrepreneurship in Europe, all over the place. Wouldn't you say that starting by leveling it would be actually a very good start? Lots of institutions in Europe are geared actually against the level playing field is tilted against innovation, also mission-driven innovation, but innovation in general and small business. So if we start by leveling it, wouldn't that be a good start?
So the reason I say that is just to be provocative, because everyone talks about leveling the playing field, and then we get what you just said, which is the playing field isn't leveled. So by tilting it, it means if we want, again, big if, maybe we don't want, if we want smart, innovation-led, sustainable, inclusive growth, if we want to get the SDGs done, if we want to get the plastic out of the ocean, it ain't gonna happen by leveling the playing field. You need to reward certain types of activities over others. So a tax structure that we currently have, which how do you say, rewards not only short-termism, millisecond trades, right? Or a capital gains tax structure, which again rewards short-termism, doesn't get you the kind of long-run investments that you need. So tilting means once you choose a direction, how do you line up all sorts of different policies that reward the activities that are going to get you, whether it's just about long-termism, whether it's about reduction of the material content, as I mentioned in steel, and really fuel the bottom-up experimentation. And that's where your point is really crucial. If we really want bottom-up experimentation, that means not leveling the playing field, but designing the tools that really help those companies that maybe aren't large enough, that don't have the assets, to be part of that game. But then you need to redesign that tool to do so. But it's not about leveling, it's about making the direction, like choosing that direction, and then lining up all the different tools from taxation to reward long-termism, not short-termism, and to then help the small companies that want to innovate towards that solution to do so, for example, through that SBIR kind of procurement policy. But blanket SME policy, like in the UK, where we spend more on SMEs than on universities, 9 billion on SMEs through different types of incentives, 8 billion on universities, doesn't get you innovation. Most SMEs, okay, I'm going to say it, are not very good, right? They're not very innovative. They're not very productive. Those that are need serious help. And there's something like 6% of SMEs that even, are in kind of the innovation game. If you just spray SME support everywhere in order to level the playing field, you're not helping your economy be more innovative. You just have a folkloric notion of small is beautiful. And that doesn't help.
Professor Mazzucato, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, colleagues, thank you very much for Mariana. And now let me introduce my close colleague, Permanent Secretary of the Ministry of Economic Affairs, Jari Gustafsson, for his final remarks. Jari, please.
Thank you, Petri. Mariana, you called for smart, sustainable, and inclusive growth. It's very easy to agree with that recipe. And this also gives a particular role for Europe, and we need to show the way. Mariana, you also ask us to be bold, inspirational, and ambitious. And this implies that we must step away from the established models for cooperation. And indeed, if we are to take the lead in launching missions, we need to go beyond the comfort zone that an established and thoroughly proved trajectory of the present world has pictures for us. When Finland have established sectorial and many times raw material-based policy frameworks aside, and they're looking for growth opportunities at the intersections of different growth drivers. Smart mobility, circular economy, smart factories, or AI are such drivers that the UK, as an example, has picked up. Those missions also feature on the long list of growth areas that have been identified. And this highlights one very well-known challenge for government goal setting. Selections will need to be justifiable and evidently concentrating on the main global challenges in a sound piece of advice. But in order to be relevant for a small country, you need to have more than aspiration and examples set by other nations. And therefore, we have to recognize that, for example, AI is a challenging selection. The popularity that it enjoys in future visions around the global makes the market very crowded. Selecting it as a guiding mission for a small country in the beginning, a lot of work to identify the real competence, both in research and in company sector, is needed, and one needs to underline the need to be objective. When Finland have a good basis in digital skills, strong network technology know-how, relatively responsive innovation system to test and experiment new ideas. Even combine the innovative capacity of all of Europe in all areas like all needs very careful analysis and direction. Private investments is to be taken into account as an important cause for market potential. We believe strongly that demand from the company sector should be a core indicator, but for example, where we concentrate the research efforts in VTT, a government-owned technical research center in Finland, the largest of its kind in Northern Europe. VTT beyond the obvious. Clean growth has been a core growth area for Finland for a number of years, and the growing understanding of the magnitude of the demands of climate change have only intensified our efforts. For us, this theme links closely with the soil health and food mission. Forest resources are a core asset for Finland, more important than for almost any country. And we have a tradition to take good care of them. You will also have taken note that these themes are also central in our presidency program. The world is full of opportunities, and as a small country with a limited number of areas of deep scientific competence and company strengths, we need to be clear and focused in our message. Indeed, the level of ambition and realism have to meet. I would also like to underline that we will need a mixture of different innovation approaches, mission-driven and focused ones, and bottom-ups, and if you like, narrow. Indeed, one of the main challenges for our innovation and entrepreneurship policies is to widen the scope of participation and increase the number of companies that engage in dedicated innovation activity. And I believe that we all here tonight share the guideline that we should provide a low threshold for SMEs to engage in innovation programs. We need a moonshot approach, but those that we would like to engage in dedicated innovation activities for the first time would probably be initially more comfortable with a more traditional career than a moon rocket. I would also want to highlight that we see it important that we could build more resilience in our economy and have a value creation fabric that can adjust to imminent changes in the world markets. We know that technology cycles are shortening and market evolution is picking up. The capacity to drive multiple competencies and solutions is crucial. There is a major challenge to make that happen in companies, and in particular in SMEs, where resources are always scarce, and all activities should be focused and purpose-driven. And still, there is a fundamental need to have more capacity to pick up alternative solutions. In addition, the call for resilience shortens the reaction time, both for mission setting and for innovation in companies. The traditional innovation model, starting in research laboratories, needs to be complemented with customer-driven activity and new co-creation models. And finally, we are currently upgrading our innovation system and seek to mobilize the resources both from government, but in particular from the enterprise sector. We are doing this in an atmosphere of financial turbulence that is caused by climate change challenges. Meeting the emission targets will call for major investment efforts for almost all sectors of the society. Turning this into a mission-driven opportunity is the main task for us to be a number of years and for many government terms to come. Thank you, Mariana, so much. And Petri.
Thank you very much, Jari Gustafsson. We have a little gift for you. Yes. We have somebody with us you met
her already in the short break before, who does graphical recording, and she recorded your speech, and that is for you to take home from us.